Welcome, loyal citizens of the Galactic Empire. Today we'll be assembling and painting the Empire Troopers from the Star Wars Legion core box set. This is a step-by-step guide to help get your models from the box to the battlefield. So let's get ready to do some hobby. So once we open the box, the first thing you'll notice is that all the miniatures come in these little baggies, so there's no sprue or anything that we need to clip the models off of, which is pretty nice. Now, all plastic minis have a mold line that runs all the way around the model, so we have to find that and get rid of it. I use a blunt scalpel for this, but you can also use a specialist tool, or you can use a file depending on the surface. The file is good for smoothing out sections like his leg here. We also want to brush away the shavings. We need to do this for all the parts. It's tedious, but it's worth it because the mold lines really show up when you're finished painting. And some more cleaning. Now we use super glue to assemble this type of plastic. I use a gel. So we just want to put a little dab on the two tabs here. Being a soft plastic, the arms will actually flex a bit. So we're just going to take the model here and pull the arms apart just a little bit to get into the tabs on the body and then press it in. Once we've done the troopers, we can start on the speeder. It has several small parts that need to go together. The first is the engine, which pops onto the rear like that. So again, we're going to use super glue for this one. The next is the little bedroll that will go onto the back of the bike, just behind the seat, like that. Next, the blaster. There's a little hole underneath where that can slot into. And this part, which is either an air intake or a spotlight, there's two contact points and there's a little indentation on one of the sides that it will line up with there. Next we have the front fins, so they will go on either side of the front forks. There's a little tab there they go into. And nearly done the pedals. So there's a bit of a rut down at the back, which the pedal will line up with like this. At this stage I will dry mount the rider just to make sure that the feet and the pedals are touching. Lastly, the leader has one of his handles that needs to be attached. It goes into a groove on the front like this, and again probably dry fit to make sure that the handle roughly lines up to his other handle when he's sitting on it. And we're done. Now this next part is totally optional, but I like to magnetize my bases, so we're going to use some 2-part epoxy putty to help stick the magnets on. So you cut off a little bit. This stuff stinks and it's toxic, so I use a glove when I'm kneading it together. And we're just going to grab a little ball of that and flatten it onto the base, then use some super glue to attach the magnets. I use a 5mm magnet for these. Now at this stage in the video I actually stuck these onto the bases with super glue and played a game, but to continue I want to take them off. So I'm using a sharp scalpel to remove them gently. Now with a sharp instrument like this applying force, I always use a cut-proof glove just to save my fingers. Now you don't have to remove the model from the base, I just think it's easier to paint the bases separately. So I'm going to mark where the guy's feet are. So I know where to put little bits and pieces. Now also for the speeder base, the little stem has a flat bit which goes towards the front. So I'm now going to drill a hole in one of the model's feet just to attach it to a setup I've got for painting later, and also this will help me pin him onto the base for a stronger fit later on when I'm all finished. So this is my painting rig. It's just a piece of wood with some round dowel, which I've drilled little holes in, and stuck a paper clip on top, and I'm just going to put that into the hole that I've just drilled. There you go. So I now have a bunch of guys who are ready for spraying and painting. Now onto the bases. Sticks. I find that using natural material gives a much better look and feel than trying to sculpt anything with green stuff. So just going to stick some sticks onto the base, and also going to use some stones. Now I file one side of the stone just so it's not popping up awkwardly. It sort of looks like it's been embedded into the ground, and glue those on too. So it looks like that. And now to spray paint those, I have a different rig. Again, it's a stick, but a long one this time. And I'm going to use some double-sided tape along the edges here and just stick all the bases on here. Now before we start spraying, I'm going to cover the little stem for the speeders with some tape, just so it stays transparent and I don't cover it with spray paint. There we go, that's what the painting rig looks like for the bases. Now I might do a more detailed spray painting video later, but spray outside within the recommended temperatures on the can and use short, sharp bursts. Once the spray is dry, the first thing I want to do is put some texture paint on the base. This is Citadel Sterling Battlemire. Now you can see I've spray painted the bases black. This is because anything that dries and pulls apart from this texture paint will provide a natural shade, and also I wanted the trees to have dark wood, so we're going to put this on really thick, like peanut butter thick, and anything that goes onto the edges just clean off with your finger. Now that'll need to dry overnight, so let's start on the Stormtroopers who I've undercoated in Grey Seer. So I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Citadel Nuln Oil and Citadel Lahmian Medium. So this is going to thin down the paint because I don't want it to be too strong a black. So I'm going to give that a good mix together, and using a medium shade brush I'm just going to go all over the miniature and make sure he's totally coated and that the Nuln Oil mix gets all the way into every crevice. I want to make sure there's no pooling though on the large flat surfaces, so you can just use the brush to move the paint around and it'll look something like that. Once that's dry, I'm going to bring the white back up. I'm going to use Citadel Grey Seer, which is the same color that I spray undercoated the model. I'm going to use a big dry brush or a makeup brush, and what you want to do is you want to wipe the vast majority of the paint off. So I just use an old paper towel and brush it off like this until I'm happy that vast majority of the paint is off. I'm going to grab the model and I'm just lightly going to go all over it like this, brushing it, and you'll see that gradually the white will get restored to the outer layers while keeping that recessed shading in the corners and in between the armor plates. You can use a smaller brush to get into the bits where the bigger brush can't get into. So I'm pretty happy with that, and that's what your model should look like using this dry brushing technique. Next, we're going to paint all the guns with contrast paint, Black Templar. I really like these paints. They flow really well into the creases and crevices. So you're kind of just guiding the paint around the model here. You don't have to use lots of brush strokes. I'm going to do the little eyes and stuff, and if you make a mistake like I just did, you can just fix that up by painting over with Grey Seer again. Alright, my Sterling Battlemire has dried, so I'm going to use some Steel Legion Drab to use the same technique, dry brushing, to give the bases a little bit more detail. So again, I'm just going to lightly go over the base, and I'm also going to dry brush the bark on the model. So just all around the model like this. And now I'm going to use Mechanicus Standard Grey and kind of a very heavy dry brush to do any of the rocks and bring them up while still leaving black in the middle. Similar technique, I'm going to use Karak Stone to do the inside wood. So that'll give me a bit of a lighter color, and then I'm going to coat the whole thing in Agrax Earthshade. This is going to give it a really wet, muddy kind of look, so coat everything, the whole base. Finally, I'm going to use a mix of Abaddon Black and Black Legion to clean up the base rim and make it nice and smooth and black. Now you could stop there and have a totally fine model for the tabletop, but we're going to keep going. I'm going to start with some lead belcher, thin it down with some water, and use it to pick out some details on the Stormtroopers, the side parts of his little rebreather thing. And I'm also going to just pick out some details on his gun just to break up the monotonous black, so the barrel and some little bits and pieces. Now I'm going to shade that with Nuln Oil. And now the heavy weapon trooper has some little bits on his backpack. I'm going to use Screaming Bell to paint those. And you can see I've also painted some of the bits on his backpack lead belcher. And again, some Nuln Oil to give it a bit of a wash. Now I'm going to use Wraithbone to highlight the little instrument panels. You can see my fingers are connecting up the top. This just helps me be a lot more stable when I'm painting these little parts. So I'm going to also paint the lenses on the rocket launcher. I'm going to just use a variety of contrast paints to paint in the details. Reds, greens, blues, just anything that you think looks good. Again, you can see for this detail painting, I always try to keep my fingers connected to get a bit more of a steady hand when I'm painting. Now the last piece of colour is the Sergeant's shoulder pads. So I'm going to use Squighound Orange for this one and Blood Angels Red for the other one. Last part is I want to make these guys feel like they're part of the base. So I'm going to dirty them up with dried bark. I'm going to use a technique called stippling. So I'm basically just dabbing the model lightly to give the effect that there's mud all over their uniforms. So that's what it looks like, and I think these guys are done. Next I'm going to use some Skeleton Horde for the Scout Troopers to do their little straps. And also I'm going to use this to paint the soles of their boots. So I'm going to keep the Skeleton Horde and add contrast medium, about a 50-50 mix. Now I'm going to paint the little satchels on his body just to give him a bit of a different shade to his armor plates. I'm also going to paint his belt buckles and the little buttons on his back black. Now onto the speeder bikes. I had sprayed these in Mechanicus Standard Grey and done a coat of Nuln Oil, so I'm going to bring it back up to the grey, and then I'm going to do a very light dry brush with Grey Sear. This will provide like an edge highlight just to the very edges of the model. Now Black Templar, I'm going to use this to coat all the parts that I want to be either metal or black. So the undersides, the little straps here, it'll look something like that. Now I'm going to use Lead Belcher to paint the parts that I want to be metal. And I'm going to use some Nuln Oil to wash those as well. Next is some Snakebite Leather for the bedrolls. So I'm going to do the bedrolls in a brown. You can use whatever brown you want. And similar to the backpack, I'm going to pick out the instrument panel parts in Wraithbone and then just use my various contrast paints to paint in the buttons. The great thing about contrast paint is you can kind of just touch the brush to the model and the paint just flows off it and into all the corners and provides its own shading and highlighting. Next is some Rhinox hide. I'm going to stipple that on to give a rusty kind of damaged effect. And I'm going to just go lightly over the model where I think bits have chipped off, then use Lead Belcher to go over those parts, and finally some Dryad Bark to represent mud that has accumulated on mostly the undersides of the model. So there we go. Next up we've got Vader, and he is mostly black, so I wanted to find a way to make the black a bit varied. So I started off with Basilican Grey on the armor panels, then went over the whole model in Black Templar. So this Basilican Grey coat means that the armor plates are just a slightly darker black than his clothing, and I just went over his eyes with some extra black. Now some Leadbelcher for little details like his chain, his belt, and some parts of his lightsaber. Went off some reference art, and apparently the fins on that lightsaber are black, and Nuln Oil over the top of any of those metal parts. And next up is some Wraithbone, and I'm going to pick out the little buttons on his control panels so it's a bit blurry. I'm also going to paint his lightsaber. Even though it's kind of white in grace here, the Wraithbone is just a bit brighter. Now again, using reference art, I'm just picking out the colors of his buttons. So he's got some gray ones, he's got some red ones, he's got some green ones, and he's got a blue one. Contrast doing its work, providing shading for these tiny little pieces, so I don't have to go back again and again to try and do it manually. For his lightsaber, I'm going to start off with Blood Angel's red and give it a first coat, a pretty thick coat, and now I'm going to use contrast medium to kind of wet blend it. So before the stain has set, just go over it and it'll look like that, just a subtle kind of gradient. Then I'm just going to finish him off with some dried bark on his cloak to blend in with the base. And once we're done, we can varnish. I use an airbrush, so make sure you use a respirator. I'm not going to go into the details, probably a second vid for that. So once the varnish is dry, we can assemble. So I use these tools to pin the models to the bases. This will give a stronger attachment so they don't come off just from normal use. I use a bit of blue tack, put it roughly where the foot with the hole will go, and I'll just line up where I think the model should go and press down. So what this does is it leaves a little imprint where the hole is that you can see just here, and this will then let me get my pin vise and drill a hole through it. So I'm going to take a paper clip, wiggle it into the hole in his foot, use some clippers to clip it pretty short but enough to go into the hole that I drilled in the base. Put some super glue on both of his feet and onto the paper clip, and then just make sure it's all aligned, stick it in like that. For the Scout Troopers, just want to put some super glue on all the contact points with the bike and just put him in. Make sure his feet are touching the pedals, make sure the handle is in the little spot. Now the stem, I'm going to remove the masking tape that we put on at the start and slot it in like so, and you should have a Scout Trooper. One last thing I added is some water effect. Now I'm going to mix the Vallejo water effect with some Mortarion grime. And now I'm going to just put that in some little puddle holes that I made earlier in the base, and just all over the base as well. This is just to really give it the look of a drenched marsh. And for the deep puddles, you might want to go and have a second coat of just the water effect, just to make it look like a really deep puddle. So just get it in there and make sure that it dries fully between coats. And while it's drying, you want to make sure it's on an even surface, and preferably somewhere that is not dusty, because if any dust gets in there, it'll show up and it won't look very good. Almost finished. Now I'm going to take some little tufts, these are 2mm tufts, and some PVA. So just going to use some tweezers to pull off the tufts one at a time. They are sticky, but I like to put a bit of PVA on the bottom just to make sure that it sticks on the base. And just pick out bits where you want the tufts to go. Just a couple on each base is fine, just where you think they would grow, near the rocks and logs and places like that. So if you've stuck it through, you now have some beautifully painted and based models ready for your games of Star Wars Legion.